This is Ops Normal Airboss's box-by-box guide to FAA Form 7711-2, the application for Certificate of Waiver or Authorization. Over the next several sections, we'll walk through every numbered item on the form, the attachments that support it, and how each piece connects to the job you actually do on show day. This is a training reference, current as of July 2026, and it's built around a real submitted package so you can see exactly what a complete FSDO-ready application looks like, rather than just an abstract description of the form.
FAA Form 7711-2 is the event organizer's application for a Certificate of Waiver or Authorizations, commonly shortened to COW or POA.
This is the document that lets an airshow operate outside the limits set by 14 CFR Part 91, specifically 91.905, or Part 17 for small UAS operations under 107.205. Without a completed application on file, no certificate can be issued at all, under 14 CFR 91.101 and 105. Once the FSDO approves the package, Form 7711-2 and everything attached to it become part of Form 7711-1, which is a certificate itself. Here's the part that matters to you directly. The Airboss doesn't sign this form. The organizer does. But your LOA, the site layout, the emergency response plan, and the security plan all ride inside this application. If something is wrong in there, it becomes your problem on show day, not the organizer's. That's why the rest of this guide treats the form from your perspective, not just the sponsors. Before we get into the individual items, here's how the submission process actually works. The event organizer, referred to on the form as the responsible person, submits the application, not the Airboss. It goes to the FAA Flight Standards District Office, the FSDO, that has jurisdiction over the event site, and it has to arrive at least 45 days before the requested event date. That 45-day clock matters a lot, and we'll come back to it later when we talk about common deficiencies. Scope varies by activity type. Air shows and other aviation events complete every applicable item, 1 through 17. Activities that don't qualify as an aviation event only need to complete items 1 through 10 plus the certification in item 17. One more detail worth remembering. A separate Form 7711-2 is required for each type of aviation event. An air show, the parachute demonstrations, a rocket launch, and a UAS demonstration each get their own form, even if they're happening at the same site. So where does the Airboss actually fit into this paperwork? The event organizer owns the application as a whole, but you own the technical accuracy of what goes into it. Practically speaking, that means a current valid Airboss LOA has to be attached to the application for any airshow. No LOA, no valid application. Beyond that, you should be reviewing 3 specific pieces before the organizer ever submits. The site depiction in item 8, the emergency response plan in item 14, and the security plan in item 13. Those 3 sections define the box you'll actually be working in, and the resources you'll have if something goes wrong. The timing here is what makes or breaks this. Catching a discrepancy after submission means rework with the FSDO, delays, and possibly missing that 45-day window we just covered. Catching the same discrepancy before submission costs you nothing but a careful read. This chart breaks down the 17 items on the form by when they apply. 11 of the 17 items apply to every application, including activities that aren't aviation events at all. Item 1 through 10 plus the certification in item 17. The remaining 6 items, 11 through 16, only apply when the application is for an air show or another aviation event. Those 6 cover the sponsor, policing, emergency facilities, air traffic control, and the schedule of events. If you're keeping score, that's the exact split shown in the donut chart. 11 items in the outer ring that always apply, 6 in the inner ring that are aviation event specific. As we move through the box-by-box breakdown, we'll flag which category each item falls into, since that tells you immediately whether a given item is relevant to the operation you're supporting. From here forward, every item slide includes a real value pulled from an actual submitted package, tagged as example, SVA 2026, so you can see the form filled out correctly rather than just described in the abstract. The event is the 2026 Silicon Valley Airshow at Moffett Federal Airfield, KNUQ, in Mountain View, California, sponsored by the Silicon Valley Airshow Association. The Airboss on record is Kurt Howerton, with an FAA ALOA on file expiring December 31st, 2027. The schedule runs a practice day on October 9th, show days on October 10th and 11th, with October 12th held as a weather contingency day. This is a 2-day show with 10 acts and roughly 80,000 spectators, including a military a 18 demonstration, and a U.S. Army Black Dagger's parachute jump. The box itself is 2.0 by 1.5 nautical miles, centered on KNUQ, with a 15,000-foot ceiling and a 500-foot show line. The full package includes attachments A through J, covering everything from responsible persons and FAR waivers to the emergency plan and show schedule, alongside the completed Form 7711-2 itself. Item 1 and 2 establish who is organizing the event and who's responsible for it. Item 1 is the name of the organization, and Item 2 is the name of the responsible person. If the organizer is an individual rather than a formal organization, Item 1 gets entered as NAA. For an airshow specifically, the Airboss must be listed in Item 2 as well, either directly or on an attached supplemental list, and you need to attach an electronic copy of your current valid FAA LO right here. In the SVA 2026 package, Item 1 lists the Silicon Valley Airshow Association, and Item 2 names Airboss Kurt Howerton, with the current LOA attached as Attachment A, expiring December 31st, 2027. Notice that this is the first place your credentials actually enter the application. If your LOA is missing or expired here, the rest of the package doesn't matter. Attachment A is where the responsible persons named back in Items 1 and 2 get fully documented, filed under Box 2 of the application. In the SVA 2026 package, this attachment names the organization and sponsor as the Silicon Valley Airshow Association, with Colonel James R. Mitchell, USAF retired, serving as the event sponsor and executive director, functioning as the responsible person. It also documents the Airboss Kurt Howerton along with his current FAA LOA status and expiration date, and notably identifies him as the FAA Incident in Charge and Incident Commander of Record for the event. That last detail is worth sitting with. This attachment is doing double duty. It's not just naming who's in charge on paper, it's establishing the actual command structure the FSDO and any responding agencies will rely on if something goes wrong during the show. Item 3 is straightforward. The permanent mailing address of the organization named in Item 1, or of the individual named in Item 2, plus a working telephone number. That phone number matters more than it looks. It's how the FSDO resolves minor discrepancies without forcing a full resubmission of the application. One detail worth flagging for consistency: this address should match the address on file for the responsible person's LOA and other credential records. Mismatches here are a common source of processing delays, since the FSDO may need to verify which address is current. In the SVA 2026 example, Item 3 lists a PO box along with a street address in Mountain View, California, and a local phone number. Simple item, but it's one of the easiest places to introduce friction if the addresses across your documents don't line up. Item 4 and 5 ask about prior waiver history. Item 4 asks whether the applicant or any principal officer or owner has a waiver application pending at another FAA office right now. Item 5 asks whether the applicant has ever had a waiver application denied or had a waiver withdrawn by the FAA. Here's the important caveat. These two items are really written for banner tower operations. For air shows and other aviation events, the standard entry is simply N/A. In the SVA 2026 package, that's exactly what you'll find. Both items marked NA, with no pending or prior denied waivers on record for the organization. Don't overthink these two boxes if you're working an airshow. Just confirm there's genuinely nothing to disclose, and move on. Item 6 is where the application gets specific about exactly which federal aviation regulations the operation needs relief from. You list each title, section, and subsection of every rule requested for waiver, along with a short description of the rule language, The reference points you need are 14 CFR 91.905, which lists the rules eligible for waiver under a Certificate of Waiver, and 14 CFR 107.205 for small UAS operations. If the event includes parachute operations, those get handled differently. 14 CFR 105.21 cites a Certificate of Authorization rather than a waiver, so don't lump parachute rules in with the rest of Item 6.
In the SVA 2026 package, 16 separate sections are waived, including
91.117, 91.119, 91.126, and 91.130, plus the 105.21 parachute authorization, all detailed further in Attachment B, which we'll look at next. Attachment B expands Item 6 into a full narrative filed under Box 6, with one row per waived CFR section. Each row includes the exact paragraph cited, a plain language description of what that rule normally requires, and the specific safety rationale for why a waiver is appropriate here. Here's a pattern worth noticing. Across all 16 waived sections in this package, the safety rationale keeps coming back to the same four mitigations every time. Airboss oversight, Airboss oversight, ICA certified performers, show line enforcement, and FAA II presence on site. That repetition isn't sloppy drafting. It's the actual backbone of how a Certificate of Waiver authorization gets justified. Whatever specific rule is being waived, the FSDO wants to see that the same layered safety structure is covering it. The 16 sections here range from 91.107, which covers safety belts, through 107.51, the UAS operating rules, showing how broad this waiver actually needs to be for a mixed manned and unmanned event. Item 7 asks for a detailed description of the proposed operation, and it explicitly invites you to attach a supplement if the space on the form isn't enough. Start by identifying the event type. Airshow, parachute demonstration, balloon competition, fly-in, military flyover, or air race, whether cross-country or closed course. From there, add as much operational detail as you can. Aircraft categories including UAS, air race classes, rocket class if applicable, and whether ground or airborne pyrotechnics are planned. That last point matters since pyrotechnics change the safety and security requirements downstream in the application. In the SVA 2026 example, Item 7 describes a 2-day public air show with 10 acts, pyrotechnics, a military FA-18 demonstration, and a parachute jump team, with the full narrative carried in Attachment C, which is where the form points you when the built-in space runs out. Attachment C is the standalone narrative description referenced from Item 7, filed under Box 7, and it's written to stand entirely on its own if the space on the printed form isn't sufficient. It covers the event description, the aerobatic box, and the requested temporary flight restriction in full detail. Two cross-references are worth tracking here. It points to Attachment D1 for the exact waiver dates and times, and to Attachment C2E for the ATC letter of agreement, both of which we'll cover later in this guide. There's also a companion document, Attachment C1, not shown in this deck, which handles the parachute-specific operational details for the Black Dagger's jump team separately from the main narrative. Keeping parachute operations in their own attachment makes sense, since they involve a different regulatory pathway, the Certificate of Authorization under 105.21 we covered back in Item 6. Item 8 is arguably the single most consequential item on the entire form from an Airboss's perspective, because it defines the box. You're describing the aviation event demonstration area, the aerobatic box, and the flying display area as a defined cell of airspace, whether that's a rectangle, a cube, or a cylinder, bounded by a runway or another identifiable geographic reference. You need the show center or center point, the radius, and the base altitude and ceiling and height above ground level for each category of aircraft, along with latitude and longitude for every point. If the site is off airport, you describe boundaries using rivers, highways, railroads, or easily identifiable landmarks instead. In the SVA 2026 package, this comes out to KNUQ, centered at 37.125 north, 122.0508 west, forming a 2.0 by 1.5 nautical mile box with a 15,000-foot ceiling and a 500-foot show line. Item 8 has several supporting attachments, and we'll walk through each one over the next few slides. Attachment C2A is the 5 nautical mile airspace diagram, filed under Box 8, and it plots the TFR boundary on a topographic base map centered on the show center coordinates from the previous slide, 37.4125 north, 122.0508 west. This diagram also documents the controlling facilities you'll be coordinating with: Moffett Air Traffic Control Tower and NorCal TRACON, with Oakland Center serving as the Air Route Traffic Control Center above them. One important caveat here: this diagram alone doesn't satisfy the full mapping requirement. A USGS 7.5 series topographic map with FSDO annotations is still required separately, as the official Box 12 diagram will cover shortly. Think of C2A as the airspace and facilities picture, and the upcoming topo map as the ground truth survey document the FSDO actually annotates and returns. Item 8 continues with a checklist of exactly what your site depiction has to show, and every single item on this list needs latitude and longitude, not just a rough sketch. 4 categories, starting with box and flight geometry: the aerobatic box itself, show lines, demonstration area boundaries, ingress and egress routes, flyby profiles, and corner markers if you're running a race course. Second, people and ground assets: primary and secondary spectator areas, the control point, static display and parking areas, and aircraft movement and refueling areas. Third, special activity areas: the parachute landing area, pyrotechnic areas, helipads, a rocket launch pad if applicable, and UAS ground control, launch, and recovery locations. Fourth, and this ties directly to the emergency response plan in item 14, primary and alternate emergency access and egress routes, pre-positioned ARF, an EMS position for a 1-minute response into the box, and land and water emergency access routes. In the SVA 2026 package, this checklist maps to a control point at the west side ramp and a parachute landing zone on taxiway Alpha's north end, documented across attachments C2A through C2D. Attachment C2B is the aerobatic box diagram itself, filed under Box 8, and it's a scale drawing of the 2.0 by 1.5 nautical mile box we've referenced throughout this section, with show lines, the primary crowd line, and both corner markers, CM1 and CM2, plotted precisely. One detail that should catch your attention operationally: the 500-foot show line distance isn't arbitrary. It's checked against the minimum distance in FAA Order 8900.1, Table 3.1a, for whatever aircraft category is actually flying that line. This is the diagram that turns the checklist from the previous slide into real, usable coordinates. Where that last slide told you what categories of information the site depiction needs to contain, this attachment is where those categories actually get drawn out with hard numbers you can verify against the order. Item 8 has one more requirement: attach current, properly marked maps, charts, drawings, or photographs. Specifically, you need a properly marked 7.5-minute series USGS topographic quadrangle map at a scale of 1 to 24,000, or an equivalent current aerial or satellite photograph. VFR sectional charts, scale diagrams, and additional photographs can supplement that base map, and GIS airport maps are available from the airport operator or the FAA Airports Division if you need a starting template. In the SVA 2026 package, this requirement is satisfied by combining attachment C2A, the airspace diagram we already covered, with attachment C2B, the aerobatic box diagram. Together, those two documents provide the mapping coverage the FSDO needs to verify the box against real terrain and airspace, without needing a separate quadrangle map filed on top of them in this case. Attachment C2D plots the Airboss control point, the parachute landing zone, and the ARF staging position, each tagged with its own GPS coordinates, filed under Box 8. In the SVA 2026 package, the Airboss control point sits at the west side ramp, and the parachute and emergency landing zone is at the north end of taxiway Alpha. What makes this attachment worth remembering is how much downstream work it anchors. These same 2 points, the control point and the LZ, get referenced again in the Item 13 security plan and the Item 14 emergency response plan later in the application. If either coordinate changes after this diagram is drawn, you're not just updating one document, you're creating an inconsistency across 3 separate parts of the package. Item 9 covers the effective dates and times of the waiver. 9A for the beginning date and hour, 9B for the ending date and hour, 9B for the ending date and hour. Enter the date as month, day, year, with a 24-hour clock time, and make sure you note the local time zone alongside the UTC offset. For example, 05/21/2026, 0900 to 1830 Central Daylight Time. UTC -5. One planning tip that pays off later? Build in a weather contingency at the outset. List alternate dates or extended hours directly on the initial application, either on the form itself or as an attachment. List alternate dates or extended hours directly on the initial application, either on the form itself or as an attachment, rather than scrambling to amend it later. In the SVA 2026 package that looks like a practice day on October 9th, show days on the 10th and 11th running 090900 to 1700, and October 12th held in reserve as a contingency day, all detailed further in Attachment D1. Attachment D1 lists the requested waiver times in full, filed under Box 9A, giving every date and hour the Certificate of Waiver needs to be active, expressed in both local time and Zulu. Two things worth noting here.
First, practice and rehearsal days are built into the waiver window, not just the 2 public show days, since the aircraft need protected airspace during rehearsals just as much as during the show itself.
Second, connects directly back to what we covered on the effective date slide. The contingency day, October 12th, is built into the request up front rather than being requested later as an amendment after the fact. That's a plan this whole section is modeling. Plan for the delay before you need it, not after. Item 10 covers aircraft, pilots, and participants. Aircraft make and model, the pilot's name, certificate number and rating, and home address, broken into parts A through D. Here's a practical detail that saves a lot of rework. The initial application doesn't need every performer listed by name yet. General categories are sufficient at first, things like Category I, 2, or 3, or flyby and reenactment aircraft, along with a note that a complete list will follow. What does need to be locked down before the event is the final list, covering every performer and aircraft, civil and military, plus air race participants, parachute teams, rockets, and UAS. And one more operational point. Any performer added after the Certificate of Waiver authorization is or added on show day itself has to show proof of qualification, airworthiness, and site suitability to the FSDO before they fly. In the SVA 2026 package, 10 acts are logged, ranging from Skip Stewart's Extra 300 EL to the US. Army Black Dagger's jump team, all detailed in Attachment E. Attachment E is the full performer roster reference from Item 10, filed under Box 10, with 1 row per act covering the performer or act name, aircraft type, N number, and either an ICAS card number or FAA authorization number. There's an act category column using codes like SA, FO, JD, PA, OA, and CE. And that column is doing more than just organizing the list. It flags which specific performers need a further military or UAS approval attachment beyond this roster. The footnote on this attachment routes you to Attachment C1 for the parachute team's additional documentation and to Attachment C2F for the military FA-18 demonstration approval. So think of Attachment E as the master index. It tells you who's flying, and it tells you exactly where to look for the extra paperwork each specialized act requires. Items 11 and 12 shift focus from the responsible person we covered back in Items 1 and 2 to the event sponsor specifically. Item 11 is the name of the organization or individual sponsoring the air event, and Item 12 is that sponsor's permanent mailing address, city, state, zip code, and telephone number. These don't always have to be the same entity as Item 2. The event organizer listed earlier may be the sponsor named here, or a separate responsible person the sponsor is delegated to manage the Certificate of Waiver authorization day to day. In the SVA 2026 package, the sponsor is the Silicon Valley Airshow Association, using the same address already entered back in Item 3. Worth remembering, Item 11 and 12 only apply to aviation events, since they fall in the 6-item block from that scope chart earlier in the deck that doesn't apply to non-aviation activities. Item 13 is where policing gets described. The provisions in place to keep the event secure and the spectators safely confined. You need to explain how spectators will be kept behind the crowd line or within the defined spectator area and who's actually responsible for enforcing that line. A written security plan, scaled to the size and complexity of the event, needs to accompany the application. If it's not ready yet, note in Item 13 that it will follow at a specified later date. One phrase worth committing to memory.
Sterile areas, including the area directly under the flying display area, must be evacuated and kept clear, and Item 13 needs to describe the method to maintain that.
In the SVA 2026 package, this responsibility falls to the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office and NASA AIM Security, with deputies posted every 550 feet, all detailed further in Attachment F. Attachment F is the full security and safety plan supporting Item 13, filed under Box 13. It names both the primary and secondary law enforcement agencies, and in this case explicitly states the joint NASA and Department of Defense jurisdiction that applies at Moffett Federal Airfield, a detail that wouldn't be obvious from the form alone. The plan defines crowd line enforcement, covering fencings, deputy spacing, and PA announcements, and it addresses hot ramp access control as a completely separate concern from crowd control, since those are different security problems with different failure modes. Emergency vehicle access routes are described here in narrative form, and then shown visually on the site map back in Attachment C2D, the same control point and LZ diagram we covered earlier. That's another example of the cross-referencing pattern running through this whole package. The narrative plan and the site diagram have to agree with each other. Item 14 covers emergency facilities, physician, ambulance, fire truck, aircraft rescue vehicle, and other options presented on the printed form as boxes to check. Here's the guidance that actually matters. Don't check the boxes on the printed form. Reference the attached emergency response plan instead. The ERP, along with its companion incident action plan, needs to fully describe how performers, essential personnel, and spectators will be protected in an emergency. And that's a level of detail no checkbox can capture. If the written ERP isn't ready yet, note in Item 14 whether it's attached now or will follow at a specified later date. In the SVA 2026 package, this is backed by ARF Index C with a 1-minute response capability, ground EMS, and Stanford Life Flight on standby, all spelled out in Attachment G, which is where the real operational detail lives. Attachment G is the emergency and rescue plan supporting Item 14, filed under Box 14, and it consolidates the ARF Index, response time, EMS type and agency, and the nearest trauma center into a single reference table you can check at a glance during the show. It also defines the knock-it-off signal, a red pyrotechnic flare, as the visual backup to the radio call. So every performer and ground crew member has a way to recognize an abort even if communications fail. Beyond that, it spells out NTSB notification requirements and lost communications procedures the Airboss follows if the radio goes down mid-show. This is the document you should know cold before you ever step up to the microphone, since it's the plan you're actually executing if something goes wrong in real time, not just a paperwork exercise for the FSDO. Item 15 addresses air traffic control. The method used to control traffic, including the arrival and departure of scheduled aircraft. This is where you describe how control of the waivered airspace transfers between ATC and the Airboss, or the race director or balloon meister depending on the event type, typically formalized through a letter of agreement. You also need to note the status of any temporary flight restriction or Class D no TAM request. And remember that TFR requests are due at least 45 days before the event, the same window we flagged back on the submission basics slide. Attach every ATC LOA or agreement between the Airboss and the controlling ATC facility here. In the SVA 2026 package, Moffett Tower on 132.3 for VHAM's airspace off to NorCal, Tracon, and Oakland Center at show close, with the full procedure documented in Attachment H. Attachment H details the airspace transfer procedures supporting Item 15, filed under Box 15. It names the controlling ATC facility, the specific transfer frequency, and the Airboss's radio call sign, so there's no ambiguity about who's talking to whom during a handoff. More importantly for you operationally, it gives the exact phraseology the Airboss transmits to release the airspace and deactivate the TFR at the end of each show day. This isn't boilerplate radio chatter. Using the precise agreed language is what makes the transfer legally and operationally clean. The attachment also requires a written log entry from the Airboss at the moment of transfer back to ATC, which creates the paper trail confirming exactly when control changed hands in case that timing is ever questioned later. Item 16 lays out the schedule of events, hour, date, and event for each scheduled activity, including the arrival and departure of scheduled aircraft, broken into parts A through C. Make sure the schedule includes the daily participant safety briefing, along with the time and location of any specialty or remote briefings. That's an easy detail to leave out and a common source of deficiencies, which we'll cover in more depth near the end of this guide. If the table printed on the form is too small for your event, submit the full schedule as an attachment, keeping the same hour, date, event ordering. One operational reminder: notify the FAA promptly if an act or demonstration gets added to the schedule after submission, though cancellations don't require advance notice unless they significantly affect the event. In the SVA 2026 package, the day runs from 0900 gates open to a 1450 pyrotechnic finale, including the 1300 Black Daggers jump, all detailed in Attachment J. Attachment J is the full show schedule supporting Item 16, filed under Box 16, laying out an act-by-act table for both show days: local time, the act or event, the performer, the aircraft, and the duration, all in one table per day. One line at the top of this attachment is worth memorizing regardless of anything else on the page. It states up front that the Airboss retains full authority to reorder or suspend acts at any time for safety. Everything else in this document is a plan. That line is the override that exists for when the plan doesn't survive contact with reality. The table structure is identical for Day 1 and Day 2, which is a deliberate choice since it makes it easy to spot exactly where the 2 days actually differ, rather than rereading each day's schedule from scratch. Item 17 is the certification and signature, a statement that the foregoing statements are true, along with the date and signature of the applicant. The organizer or sponsor named back in Item 1 or Item 2 has to sign and date the certification before the FSDO will accept the application at all. Signing here means accepting full responsibility for observing the terms of the Certificate of Waiver authorization. And it's worth remembering that the authorization granted is strictly limited to exactly the operation described on the form, nothing broader. As a reminder from earlier in this guide, activities that aren't an aviation event only need to complete items 1 through 10 plus this certification in item 17, skipping the aviation event specific items in between. In the SVA 2026 package, a completed package was submitted September 1st, 2026, over a month ahead of that 45-day minimum, giving the FSDO plenty of buffer for review. This is the package cover sheet, a one-page summary of every key value from the form: the event, dates, airport, organization, Airboss. The event dates, airport, organization, Airboss. The FARs requested for waiver, and the submission date, all in a single glance. Below it, a list of attachment table cross-references each attachment to its specific box number on the form and shows its generation status, so anyone reviewing the package can immediately confirm nothing is missing. It's important to be clear about what this cover sheet is and isn't. The FAA form itself is still attached and signed manually. This cover sheet doesn't replace it. Everything on this page is generated in advance purely to speed up FSDO review, giving the reviewer a map of the package before they dig into the individual attachments themselves. This slide consolidates everything we've covered into a single required attachment checklist, modeled directly on the 10 attachments filed for the SVA 2026 package. A properly marked topographic quadrangle map or equivalent aerial photo. A site layout diagram showing the box, show lines, spectator areas, and control point. The security and crowd management plan, the emergency response plan and incident action plan, a current Airboss LOA in electronic form, statement of aerobatic competency cards for aerobatic performers, DD Form 2535 for any military flyovers or performances, ATC letters of agreement, the TFR NOTAM request or frequency application confirmation, and the complete performer, aircraft, and participant list in its final version. These 10 items map directly onto attachments A through J that we walk through individually across this guide. If you're building a package from scratch, this is the checklist to work from before you ever open the form itself. This timeline shows how the application actually moves through the FAA once it's submitted. At day minus 45, or earlier if you can manage it, the organizer submits Form 7711-2 and its attachments to the FSDO with jurisdiction over the event site. From there, the FSDO reviews the package for discrepancies and coordinates with ATC, and for Part 139 airports, also coordinates with the Airport District Office. By around day minus 30, any non-standard ATC provisions and Part 139 ADO coordination need to be finalized. The FSDO then reaches a decision, marking the application either approved or disapproved, with reasons documented in the remarks section if it's disapproved. Once approved, Form 7711-2 and its attachments become part of Form 7711-1, the actual Certificate of Waiver or Authorization. Notice how much of this timeline depends on the 45-day submission window we've referenced throughout this guide. Submit late, and every downstream step in this process gets compressed or put at risk. Here's a consolidated list of the deficiencies that come up most often and are worth checking for before you ever let a package go to the FSDO. First, a site depiction missing latitude and longitude for the box, show lines, or spectator areas, which we covered in detail back in Item 8. Second, an ERP that doesn't include a 1-minute rapid response plan for ARF and EMS into the Aerobatic box, undermining the whole point of Item 14. Third, an Airboss LOA that's missing, expired, or simply never attached to the application, which invalidates Items 1 and 2 regardless of how well the rest of the package is written. Fourth, a schedule of events that omits the daily participant safety briefing time and location, a detail from Item 16 that's easy to overlook. And fifth, an application submitted inside the 45-day window with no justification offered for the delay. Every one of these is preventable with a careful pre-submission review, which is exactly the review role we described for the Airboss back at the start of this guide. Let's bring this together. Form 7711-2 is the application. Form 7711-1 is the certificate it becomes once the FSDO approves it. There are 17 items in total, but only items 1 through 10 and the certification in Item 17 apply to activities that aren't aviation events, while the remaining 6 items are specific to air shows and similar events. The attachments, the map, the ERP, the security plan, and your Airboss LOA carry just as much weight in this package as the form itself. A technically complete form with a weak attachment package is still an incomplete application in practice. And the theme running through this entire guide is timing. Airboss review before submission prevents rework after submission. This has been a training reference only. Before any operational application, verify every requirement against the current ABRP manual, the applicable FAA orders, and guidance from your specific FSDO, since local practice can add detail beyond what's covered here.